Good morning, everybody. My name is Santiago Canton. I'm the director of the Human Rights Program of the Robert F. Kennedy Center. During a short period of time, about 2-3 years, I was a special rapporteur on freedom of expression, and that's why I believe they invited me to moderate this panel. And until a few months ago, I was the executive secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. So most of my experience is related to the Inter-American system. Before we start with this panel, I will ask everybody to silence the phone, please. We are all very busy, very important, but let's make sure we are not interrupted when we make the presentation. And before we go into these excellent panels that we have this morning here, I will ask the ambassador of Norway to the UN, Geir Pedersen, to give the welcoming remarks. Mr. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good to see so many of you on a cold morning in New York. And heartily welcome both to member states, excellencies that I see around in the audience, and to all of the nice and beautiful friends sitting around here. I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting day. And thanks a lot to this very insight panel that I'm very much looking forward to be a part of. Genocide, the crime without name, was coined in the immediate aftermath of World War II by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin. And it was here at the United Nations in New York that Lemkin and others lobbied at the early sessions of this world organization for the crime of genocide to become part of the emerging field of international law, and ultimately for the General Assembly's adoption of the Genocide Convention in 1948. 65 years later, we are reminded that genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing have surfaced all too many times in world history. Despite the Convention's declaration that direct and public incitement to commit genocide is crime, horrors such as Rwanda and Srebrenica haunt us today. As the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda reminded us when addressing the radio broadcasters who in different wording called for murder, and I quote, "Even without a firearm, machete or any physical weapon, hate speech may cause the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians. The power of the media to create and destroy fundamental human values comes with great responsibility. And those who control the media are accountable for its consequences." End of quote. After our own national tragedy on the 22nd of July 2011 in Norway, when one person massacred 77 civilians in Oslo and on the island Utøya, we have had to realize that hate speech on the internet against minorities in the Norwegian society is a reality. So is hate speech against multiculturalism, plurality, and tolerance. We find this extremely worrying. However, when considering the approach to this, we must recognize that freedom of expression constitutes one of the essential foundations of a democratic society. Thus so far in Norway, we have refrained from altering our hate speech laws. We are, however, in the process of ensuring that our criminal code applies in full to acts committed on the internet. As societies, threats and challenges change over time, so has the debate in Norway on how to find the right balance between combating hate speech without curtailing the freedom of expression. Dialogue, such as the one we have ahead of us here today, may help us explore the tools to strike that fine balance. Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide recently opened a seminar for Al Jazeera journalists on human rights, and he underlined that we will not compromise on freedom of expression, but also call for respectful application of common sense. Discussions on voluntary codes of ethics and professionalism in the media could be an alternative way forward. Let me take this opportunity to thank the Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression, Mr. Frank Roux, who is sitting here beside me, who is here today, as you can see, for his important report last year. His report focused on expressions that do not give rise to criminal or civil sanctions, but still raise concern in terms of tolerance, civility and respect for others. It also underscores the importance of complementing laws with a broad set of policy measures to bring about genuine changes in mindsets, perception and discourse. We need to fight the root causes of hate speech, racism and discrimination. In 2006, in the aftermath of the cartoon incidents, Indonesia and Norway initiated a global intermedia dialogue and invited 100 editors, journalists to discuss how to handle global challenges like the cartoon incident. The International Federation of Journalists, represented here today by former Secretary General Aidan White, took active part, and so did the Indonesian Press Council. More intercultural and interreligious dialogue was of a common answer in 2006. It still is today. I look forward to listening to the insights of today's panelists and engage in dialogue with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Let me now pass the floor for the keynote speech of this morning panel to Adam Ading, UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Mr. Ading, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and to the Permanent Mission of Norway to the United Nations for their assistance in organizing this event here today, as well as a second similar event that will take place at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. on 5th February. I believe that these events are extremely relevant and timely in light of recent developments, including, as mentioned by our colleague Pedersen, the widespread violent demonstration against the West triggered by an anti-Islam movie and cartoons in September 2012. I'm about to go to Kenya, where in the run-up to the election of 4th March, there have been numerous initiatives taken to try to prevent the kind of hate speech that contributed to the incitement of ethnic violence in Kenya following the 2008 elections. And I commend the government of Kenya for having, at that time, enacted a law to prevent hate speech. Hate speech and incitement are global issues that concern us all. In my opening remarks today, I will try to explore the topic of incitement from both an early warning and a policy perspective. In this context, I will explain why my office distinguishes hate speech from incitement to atrocity crimes and considers incitement as an early warning indicator for atrocity crimes. Moreover, I will continue by highlighting our collaboration on prohibition on incitement with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I will then conclude by sharing with you the work done by my office to curb and prevent incitement to atrocity crimes. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during my past assignment as Registrar for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and in my current role as Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide, I have been witness to the role that the most extreme form of hate speech, incitement, can play in instigating atrocity crimes, and of role that prevention could play in preventing or stopping such crimes. Not all hate speech constitute incitement to mass violence, but when it does, it can trigger mass violence. There have been several initiatives to identify the factors that make speech dangerous, as well as the measures that can be taken to limit the dangerousness of hate speech. Balancing efforts to protect freedom of expression, these initiatives have identified factors to help distinguish hate speech from incitement to ethnic, racial, religious, and national violence, including the severity, content, extent, imminence, likelihood, and context of the speech. However, we need more clarity on what constitutes incitement to atrocity crimes, especially because by better knowing what constitutes incitement, we can also better limit or control it. This, in turn, is essential to prevent mass violence. In order to shed more clarity on the issue of incitement, my office has participated in a series of expert workshops organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on preventing incitement to racial, religious, and national hatred. In line with the outcome of these workshops, the last of which was held in Morocco in September last year, I'm of the view that there are three main points to be taken into consideration for strengthening national and international efforts to curb incitement. First, Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, states, and I quote, "Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law." The use of this article should be exceptional, as incitement to ethnic, racial, or religious hatred, the most extreme form of hate speech, usually happens in extraordinary circumstances. It is important, therefore, to balance the freedom of expression with the need to prevent or stop the most extreme cases of hate speech, those that have the potential to incite to mass violence. Second, acknowledging that the human sentiments of hatred and discrimination go deeper than the offenses of discrimination, hate crimes, and incitement, we must recognize the limits of legislation, and especially of criminal law, to combat hate speech and incitement. In this context, we need to develop a multi-layered approach to fight the root causes of hate speech, racism, and discrimination. This approach should include promoting human rights and tolerance, encouraging dialogue and understanding among different groups, and building the capacities of national authorities, security officials, and journalists to create an environment conducive to preventing acts of incitement to hatred. As the permanent representative of Argentina was telling me yesterday, big massacres start with little actions and behaviors. Language is at the core of it. Stereotypes can kill. Even in neutral environments, we use language that has implicit stereotype in it. Here at the United Nations, she was saying, for example, we speak about blacklist, which is a commendable blacklist with something negative. We also speak about tolerance, which is commendable objective, but even this word has some embrace. On the contrary, she was saying, when we recognize someone, we accept the difference in a positive light. We need to be most careful with the language we use and the expression we perpetrate. And I cannot but fully share her view. And in this context, it is also imperative to underline the role that member states and civil societies are doing excellent work with regard to exploring ways to curb hate speech and limit the impact of incitement. The moment has arrived to share our different experiences, join hands, and build strong partnership on these important matters. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have before us today a panel of renowned experts who will provide us with useful insight into this challenging subject and will help us to address the ongoing challenge of reconciling the need to promote the right to freedom of opinion and expression, while also combating incitement that could lead to genocide and violence based on hatred. I would like to thank all of them, and I would like to thank all of you, our partners, working with us to create a space for constructive dialogue and discussion on these timely issues. I would also like to thank you all for participating in this event, and I hope that today's discussion will pave the way for a united approach to putting our words and excellent intention into action. That is not always obvious. We tend to speak a lot, but unfortunately we don't act enough. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ding. I think the framework for this panel has been very clearly established by the two previous speakers. What's the right balance for freedom of expression? Where do we draw the line? Where do we put a limit to freedom of expression, but at the same time making sure that freedom of expression is still very vibrant and open so we can have a very strong democracy? Mr. Ding also referred to where is the line between hate and incitement to atrocities, and that's an important part of the discussion that has to take in this panel. And finally, what are the root causes of incitement to violence, of hate speech, and how can we work on those root causes? Those are, at least on my view, one of the most important discussions we need to have, and we cannot have a better group of experts than the one we have around here. So let's start with the discussion. To start with, I will ask Mr. Frank LaRue, a good friend, to start with to present his paper. Thanks.
And thank you for all the work of all the organizers in this panel. It's a pleasure to be here with Mr. Ambassador of Norway and Mr. Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide of the UN and all the other fellow panelists. This was probably one of the most difficult tasks I've ever had. A special rapporteur on freedom of expression. One wants to think always in the positive and never in the negative. But it's also true the circumstances around the world force us to reflect oftentimes on the limitations of a right. And as we say, freedom of opinion has no limitations. Freedom of expression does have some highly qualified limitations. And the events around the world, the violence that has erupted because of certain messages, rightfully or wrongfully, forced us to look deeper into this issue and to try to separate what should be a legitimate limitation of some forms of message and what is not a legitimate limitation and is being used, and violence is being used as an excuse to limit some messages. Let me begin by saying, number one, that I strongly believe that the best approach is more communication. I often mention the Constitution of UNESCO, where Article 1 of the Constitution of UNESCO says that it was established as an institution to promote peace in the world by facilitating the free flow of ideas and knowledge amongst peoples of the world. And this is what we should all try to build, a free flow of ideas and knowledge, the better understanding among peoples of different ethnic, racial, religious, of different type of majorities or minorities, of different corners of the world. And with that better understanding, we should evolve to a more human world with less violence. So my first focus is that. Secondly, let me say as a broad conclusion in my report, you will find that the best way to approach the hateful speech, the offensive speech, those that are trying to incite, is by prevention. we must look, as Mr. Dian was saying, to the root causes of the racism, the hatred, the discrimination, the stereotypes, and try to address those root causes and try to prove to the world that we're all human beings that share equal dignity and given that equal rights. This is also very important because the first responsibility is of our entire society to build a culture of peace. Now, having said that, we do have Article 20, which is part of my mandate. So I was trying to address, in a way, Article 20, that what actually constitutes the type of speech that should be prohibited by states. And this is very much linked to the mandate of the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide, because preventing genocide is not only preventing the act itself, it's preventing the causes that leads to that act and preventing the messages and the incitement to genocide. And I would say that we look at different instruments of human rights, and we find in third there is, again, the responsibility of states to try to confront any speech that tries to mark a superiority of one race or social group above another. Or in the optional protocol on trafficking of children on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, we have a very clear prohibition on any form of messages that shows, presents, disseminates, or commercializes child pornography, and for me an act of violence in itself, but also an incitement to more violence against children and also to sexual harassment and trafficking of children. So we have clearly from human rights standards the need to focus states on some type of messages that should be addressed. But how do we do that without breaking the boundaries of freedom of expression? Because ultimately freedom of expression has to be the global open principle. Freedom of expression has to be seen in the most open mind. And I find with preoccupation that many countries, especially because of the new technologies of internet, but it has happened in the past before, many countries are trying to focus their attention on the limitations, which I think is a mistake. Limitations should exist, but should be the exception. And the exception just to protect citizens from an clear and imminent harm. And here's where I presented one of my general conclusions in the report that you will find in the report, which is, by the way, on the webpage of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, is that the state has an obligation to protect individuals from harm, but does not have the obligation to protect individuals from offense. So the fact that some people feel offended by a statement, which I think is very tragic because I don't believe in offensive speech, by the way, but I also don't think it is the state that should have the responsibility of protecting anyone from offensive speech. I think the state has to protect individuals from incitement to very clear physical harm. It can be physical, it can be legal, it can be forms of discrimination, but a form of imminent harm. And here's where we did a series of consultations around the world, with the support, by the way, of Norway and of Open Society Foundation. And it was very interesting to look at how different cultures and different places. I participated in all the consultations of the High Commissioner that Mr. Dian mentioned, including the Rabat meeting was the conclusion. So in drawing all that, it was very clear, number one, that some instruments of human rights talk about prohibition, not criminalization. So not all prohibition of some messages has to be through criminal law. It can be through other means. It can be through civil laws, through civil initiatives to order people to correct a statement or to allow a response or to some economic fine. Not everything has to be solved with criminal law. But some of them, yes, should be criminalized. Specifically, the incitement to genocide. Genocide is recognized as an international crime. Therefore, incitement to commit genocide should also be criminalized. The same way that I believe child pornography is incitement to child abuse and child violence, and therefore normally committed by organized crime, therefore should be criminalized as well. So in the consultation, there were several NGOs. One NGO, Article 19, made a very good proposal, said let's put the highest standards possible to define what can actually be criminalized in terms of offensive and hate messages. And there were several benchmarks established, which dealt with how high the standard should be by all states to be able to punish and criminalize some statements. One was the severity of the message. The other was the intent. This is crucial. There has to be an intent to create damage and to damage someone. The content and extent of the message. The likelihood of the likelihood of harm to other individuals, the imminence of that harm, and the context in which this message is presented that facilitates the harm to happen. The context varies a lot because it's not the same to make an offensive message in a place where everyone will reject it than to make an offensive message where you will actually have mobs taking it up. So clearly there are standards that we can set to define the responsibility of the state when some of these messages can be criminalized. But I strongly believe, like I said, yes, genocide has to be prevented and incitement to genocide should be forbidden criminally. Child pornography, incitement to participate in organized crime, incitement to terrorism and terrorist acts. Those are legitimately criminalized. But not any statement, and certainly not the debate on theoretical issues, whether it be schools of thought, philosophies, ideologies, or even religion. This is one of the most difficult ones because I personally believe that we should all be as respectful as possible to each other. But I also believe that we should have as open a debate as possible. And some people easily get offended by religious discourse or religious debate. I believe, for instance, that all the blasphemy laws or defamation of religion called in different places are a violation of freedom of expression because this is an area where we should defend free speech and free dialogue and free debate. So I think I'm trying to be as precise, not being soft. I'm trying to be as strong and strict because if we would have prevented Rwanda with the Radio Mille Collines, we would have been able, the international community, we would have all been able to save many lives. So I think some prohibitions have to be strong, have to be timely, and have to be firm in the law. But generally speaking, we also have to agree that the best remedy is to build understanding among peoples of the world, to expand the concept of freedom of expression, to have as few limitations as possible so we can actually have more freedom of expression and not less, more understanding and more peace in the world. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Frank. Now I pass the floor to Susan Bennett. Susan is the Edith Everett Genocide Prevention Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she's also the founder of the Dangerous Speech Project at the World Policy Institute. So, Susan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Building on the remarks by His Excellency, by the Special Advisor, and by the Special Rapporteur, with which I agree entirely, I want to talk to you about speech that can catalyze heinous collective violence, including genocide, and about what can be done specifically and concretely to inhibit that. Speech is enormously powerful. It is the essential tool for bringing about any collective action, including violence. Language is at the core of it, as the Special Advisor has pointed out to us. But not all speech has the same capacity or force to drive action, as you've already heard, not even all hateful speech. So we seem already to agree that we must focus on prohibiting and diminishing speech that has a special power to lead collective violence such as genocide. Not least because, as the Special Rapporteur, Frank Leroux, has pointed out, freedom of expression must be protected, not only as a right in and of itself, but because repressing freedom of expression may in itself increase the likelihood of violence. So we have these two goals that must be pursued with equal vigor and avidity. The solution is to concentrate on speech that is dangerous, in other words, that has this special capacity to catalyze violence. Like the NGO Article 19, I have proposed some ideas to practically make distinctions between speech that is hateful or insulting or offensive, and speech, on the other hand, that has this special capacity. My proposals overlap a great deal with Article 19. We've come at many of the same conclusions via different paths. My own has been maybe not so enviable. I've studied many examples of this type of speech, looking for what it is that distinguishes it, and have been struck to find patterns from country to country and from historical period to historical period. So I believe indeed one can identify this speech that constitutes incitement, that has a special capacity to succeed, in other words, to catalyze collective violence. So very quickly, I'll just fill you in on that. I think that being able to identify such speech gives us a useful tool, not only for early warning, but for specific targeted interventions to limit its effect. And I will conclude my brief remarks, I promise, with some concrete proposals for doing that, some of which have already been tried in Kenya as in some other countries, and I'll give you just some quick examples. So first of all, I believe that there are 5 criteria with which one can capture or at least make a decent guess at the dangerousness of a particular speech act in the context in which it was made or disseminated. The first 3 were already identified by Aristotle, so I'm coming along quite late to this effort. First of all, as you know already, some speakers have a much greater capacity to influence particular audiences than others. I also am a professor, and as I often tell my students, I'm unable to commit successful incitement because there's no audience, including them, that cares that much what I think. I'm hoping perhaps to win all of you around to my ideas, but certainly not to incite you. In any case, there are some speakers who have a terrible power to motivate particular audiences, and therefore the fact that a particular speaker has made a particular call to violence would itself confer greater force or greater impact on that act of speech. The second factor is the audience. Again, as you know with a moment's thought, some audiences are more susceptible, more disposed to reacting to speech that attempts to incite them. The third criterion is the speech act itself. In order for speech to constitute incitement, of course, particularly incitement to violence or to genocide, of course it has to be understood by that audience most likely to react as a call to action. While we're on this third criterion of the speech act itself, I'd like to let you know that I've been struck at some patterns that emerge from studying these examples of speech, and I'll tell you just 3 of those patterns or telltale signs or hallmarks of what I call dangerous speech, that is incitement to violence that has a reasonable chance of succeeding. The first is to describe the target group as something other than human, as animals, as pests, or as vermin. I'm sure, unfortunately, you can think of many examples off the top of your heads. They're exceptionally common, and within all of the horrible creatures to which human beings compare other human beings, 2 seem to be most common, that is rats and cockroaches, perhaps because those are such universally despised creatures. This seems to be an important rhetorical move in incitement because it allows people to begin to see violence against other human beings as acceptable. If the others don't seem really human, then atrocities become more acceptable. The second hallmark or telltale sign I'd like to describe to you was named by a Hutu propaganda strategist, accusation in a mirror. That's an uncannily, an ingenious description, because this is when you, as a speaker, tell your own group that another group, the target group, is planning to annihilate them. In other words, you tell your group that the other group is planning to do to them what in fact you are hoping to incite the group to carry out itself. This is important because it makes violence seem not only acceptable but in fact necessary. It's like a collective analog of the only ironclad defense to murder in every legal system, which, as you know, is self-defense. The third telltale sign or hallmark that I've found jumping out of the data of studying cases is to suggest that members of the target group are poisoning, soiling, or staining the purity or integrity of the audience, of the speaker's own group. So a speaker describes Jews as rotten apples who can spoil an entire barrel, or describes members of one tribe in Kenya as weeds living among a majority population from another tribe. Unfortunately, I could go on and give you many more examples, but I'd like to get quickly to discussing instead what can be done. The most obvious answers, if we are thinking about what can be done about speech, of course, is to silence it, either by punishing the speaker or switching off his microphone, literally or figuratively. As the special rapporteur has said, there are many alternatives to the most obvious way of silencing a speaker, or the most common, which would be prosecution. These include requiring a correction of the speech. There are many methods that bear further experimentation, in my view, such as political sanctions in the course of political campaigns in which inflammatory speech is all too common in many countries. It might be possible to threaten candidates with being barred from candidacy, for example. However, any form of speech repression is to be embarked on very cautiously, as the special rapporteur has said, because of the importance of protecting freedom of expression, but also because such efforts often backfire, and frankly because they are often used disproportionately by states against political opponents. So instead, I'd like to suggest two alternatives. The first one is what I call inoculating the audience. You will hear much more detail from one of the world's foremost practitioners of that in just a few moments. That is George Weiss, my friend and colleague sitting next to me. This means working with an audience in order to make them, the people, less susceptible to incitement. If people were not impressed by the message, by the hateful, destructive, violence-seeking message of a speaker, then the speaker could go, in theory, could go on and on with that message, but not successfully catalyze violence. I have also done some experimenting with this method, for example, most recently in Kenya, and don't have time to talk about it, but will be glad to answer questions if you're interested. A second way of interfering with inflammatory speech without consequences for freedom of expression is for other influential speakers to, as Frank LaRue has said, to add more speech, but in a specific way which I'd like to propose. And I'd like to suggest that this is even an obligation of states under the responsibility to protect. There are situations in which an inflammatory speaker has particular sway over an audience, and which certain kinds of speech have historically, unfortunately, made a great impact. There are also cases in which other influential speakers have courageously spoken out to denounce that inflammatory speech and managed to sway public opinion back in the right direction. And successfully, in other words, countering the inflammatory message. Under the constitutive documents of the responsibility to protect, for example, in the 2005 World Summit Outcome document, the possibility of preventing violence by countering incitement is clearly described, establishing for us guidance to states and also to political actors and other influential figures to employ this message, for example, to speak out and denounce inflammatory speech and thereby countering its effect. I see that I'm out of time, so I'll conclude with that and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. I know what I'm going to say is not very appropriate for a panel regarding freedom of expression, but we have to make a break, a 1-minute break, because the sound system is not working well, so they have to reboot all the system. So for 1 minute, we are not going to be able to continue. Don't go too far, please. Can we start, please?
I hope we get to walk again. I have a unique collection for the screen.
We are going to start. Apologies for the interruption. Let's continue with the panel. The next speaker is George Weiss. George is the founder of Radio La Benevolencia. It's unfortunately similar in Spanish and the others, so I can pronounce that one. It's a humanitarian tools foundation. It's a Dutch NGO that uses education and psychoeducation to combat hate speech and empower victims in Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, George.
Hello. Yeah, well, my presentation kind of flows into Susan's presentation about the different issues surrounding hate speech. I think my project adds the psychological dimension to it. That means we have a project that tries to what we call inoculating audiences from hate speech. And that is a psychological project. It's basically so that if you think about Goebbels or the people who worked at RTLM or anywhere like that, they didn't go to university in order to know how to get the effect that they were getting. They somehow expressed instinctively something that their audience was living through. And that is where they take their power from. And when the way we came across this was in the former Yugoslavia between 1992 and 1994 there was the Bosnian War, and during that time it was very remarkable. The propaganda language used by all sides was all referring to World War II. One side were the Ustaše, the other side were the Chetniks. Everybody referred to the other leaders as Hitler. Everywhere was Auschwitz. There was something about World War II that was moving people's minds, and they were basically touching upon old wounds that were reopened by the violence that was taking place. And so we hit upon an idea for a program called Hate, a Course in 10 Lessons. It wasn't called Love, a Course in 10 Lessons, because it was addressed to perpetrators. It was trying to stimulate combating parties. That means people that are at no time ready to talk with each other, to talk about something. And we devised a debate program that simply talked about World War II and the reason for the languages they were using, with the aim to get them themselves to say, hey, the same thing happened here in Yugoslavia too. So there was the disintegration of the Weimar Republic, for example, which led to the rise of Nazism, which led to in-grouping and out-grouping, leaders pointing to the other group and drawing force from showing how destructive they were. And there was the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, which had people go together, do in-grouping in their own national groups and refer to each other in a similar way. That was basically the basic idea of the program. We then looked for psychological consultants that specialized in comparative analysis of the psychology of perpetrators in genocides, and we came across the work of Professor Erwin Staub, who is now the head of our academic team, who devised a very simple, and simple is actually the key here, way of categorizing the psychological development of perpetrators into genocide. And it starts with something that usually is left out very easily, which is difficult, so-called difficult life circumstances, a breakdown of structure which creates insecurity in people and which creates this in-grouping that makes them need to have someone show them a way out, someone show them some kind of a solution, which then comes in the form of scapegoating, basically, of saying the other one is to blame. And as we engaged these psychological consultants, they were just then invited by the government of Rwanda to teach this psychological subject matter in Rwanda. And as a result of this, we found ourselves invited into Rwanda in order to propagate this psychological subject matter to a grander public. So the idea was simply to embed vocabulary of this psychology that must be in everybody and that everybody can recognize into an audience, so that when they are faced with this happening, they will themselves recognize some key words, some key sentiments, some key traumas that are being touched, and they will be encouraged to resist this development. So what we have is 3 different policies in order to achieve that in our prototype project in Rwanda, which is, well, first of all, we try to be non-polarizing. That means we try to not speak directly to our audiences. We don't try to tell our audiences, you should do this and you should do that. This would provoke immediate defensive reactions, and so we try and get into some kind of a virtual environment, like, for example, in Yugoslavia, discussing World War II instead of discussing what was happening to them. And we use then media and, you can call it, propaganda techniques in order to embed this vocabulary in our audiences. And we promote one role model, and that is the role model of somebody we call active bystanders. An active bystander is a person, sometimes it's called upstander, sometimes it's called a person with civil courage. It is a person who speaks out early and timely against the development he sees. And what we then have is a very powerful media project, because the propaganda techniques, the media techniques that we use are used widely nowadays in Africa especially, but also in South America and Asia, in education and entertainment. That means the programs that end up with telling people to put on a condom or to put on a malaria net to protect themselves from health hazards. And these programs usually use 2 to 3 messages, key messages, and we use 36 messages actually that we put in our storylines. Storylines is also another key, because we create dramas, serial dramas. Our serial drama in Rwanda has been running now for 9 years, in which there is a virtual environment. That means there are 2 villages that fight each other. In each village you have the same social phenomena happening. You have leaders rising up, you have active bystanders rising up against them. They attack each other and they counter-attack one another, so that nobody is more guilty than the other person. These soap operas are targeted to a majority audience, and we complement them with debate programs that are targeting the leaders, whom we actually treat as part of the audience. And the education entertainment technique part of it, besides a technique for putting all these messages into the storylines, is that you add an element of practice. That means we also create networks of grassroots groups spread all over the country that listen to our broadcasts and then try and emulate the role models that we give them. This program was also evaluated on an independent basis by researchers from Yale University and other universities once every 3 years, and because of some quite unexpected success that we scored after about 1 year already in terms of evaluating people's behaviors and also the difference between the people that were listening to our broadcast and people that were not listening, we were asked to spread our project, and so we spread it to Burundi and the DRC. two countries that have actually quite different environments from Rwanda, where you actually have to answer to different contexts. In the course of doing that, and that is a project now that is running for 10 years, we also instituted in Burundi especially and in the DRC what are called early warning projects. That means we used our soap operas and our other programs in order to, and the networks of civil society bystanders that we have, in order to feed information similar to what Ushahidi does to a central network of radio journalists and other program makers in order for them to make programs that directly react to the incidences of violences that were happening. And in the case of the Burundi election that took place in 2010, this actually scored some success, it may be said, because there was an incident where all the opposition parties didn't accept the results of the elections in Burundi, and they actually started spreading hate speech in order to incite people to rise up, playing some of the old cards that had ignited the old Burundi violence. And because we had organized, together with other organizations, a synergy of media that was broadcasting informative programs about different incidences of violence, so together with sketches also that showed incidences of hate speech, again in virtual environments, the population stayed pretty calm, and that has to do with many different factors, but it actually also is part of a success of a program that does psychology together with using different criteria for hate speech. So that means if you want to really act against hate speech, you cannot only react, you have to prepare, and you cannot only train media makers, leaders, or journalists to say the right things, because basically the audience understands what they wanted to say when they're in the right state to understand it already. And it is that, making them recognize that they are in a state where they are malleable, that you can deal with some of these education and entertainment projects that deal with hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Now I will give the floor to Aidan White. He's the founding director of the Ethical Journalism Network. It's a global campaign to promote ethics and good governance across all media platforms. Aidan.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak. I mean, I can't think, coming from a sort of not an academic or a diplomatic background or from the international community directly. I come very much from the journalistic community, and I can't think of a more important issue to put before the community of journalists and media than this one today. I represent an organization which brings together newspaper broadcasting proprietors, online journalists, owners, broadcasters and so on, all of whom have a shared commitment to the notion of ethics in journalism. And there's an ethical challenge today which is very great. I'm very grateful to hear from George about how one needs to build upon the notion that human beings are ethical animals, and one needs to feed them with information which will help them to make choices, help them to be actually a part of society. The problem that we have in taking this debate and broadening it into the mainstream of public discourse, which I think is the major challenge, is that we do need media and journalism, and unfortunately we do so at a time in which there is a sort of perfect storm that has enveloped media and journalism. You have the problem of changing structural nature of media and journalism, which has changed absolutely the way journalists themselves work and the way that media interact with their audience, and the audience is very much part of the process now, thanks to social networks and so on. We have economic austerity in many parts of the world, which is reinforcing public anxiety and creating opportunities for unscrupulous politicians to be able to make ground and and so on. And we have the reality of mass migrations taking place on almost all continents, all of which are raising sort of uncertainties and so on, and are being used, as I say, in order to develop what I think is sort of poisonous debate in this area. And so the big question is how we deal with hate speech and xenophobia, which is the great challenge we have today. I think that some of the points here that have been made are extremely valuable and extremely important, both what Frank and others have said about the need to be proportionate in the use of law is absolutely clear. It seems to me that we have a major task, and certainly we in the journalistic profession have a major task in this moment of real crisis when economic resources are not being made available to invest in research and good journalism. We have to find a way of re-engaging journalists with their mission, with the sort of central tenets of their profession. The problem is that bad journalism reinforces ignorance and can lead to rumour, speculation and further hatreds, and often does. Good journalism is the antidote, of course. It promotes understanding, it builds confidence and eases anxiety. But good journalism is not just about giving facts. We have to recognise that today journalism is just not about giving facts. The social networks provide people with facts. Journalism has actually a role which is so fundamentally important. It's about providing context, analysis, informed commentary on the impact of facts and events on people's lives. If people don't have that raw material of good analysis, good commentary, good background, how on earth are they going to be equipped to take the decisions that are necessary to actually help them to participate in a positive way in society? So the central question we've got here is how do we reinforce the capacity for good ethical journalism? That's one of the reasons why so many years spent representing journalists I decided to focus not on the technical, not on technology, not on the future of media, not on the whiz-bang changes that are taking place in the open information landscape, but actually on the content, on the quality of the content, because that doesn't change, and it's actually what people need. So we need, first of all, to promote re-engagement with the values of truth-telling, independence, accountability, humanity, and impartial reporting. And these are not strange ideas. They're cardinal principles of journalism which have always been there, but are increasingly forgotten. Secondly, we need to encourage within media much more engagement in how they tackle these problems. We need within the media, from the boardroom to the newsroom, we need a commitment to good corporate governance and self-regulation, and a commitment to values. Because even in the most democratic countries, and the Leveson inquiry in the United Kingdom has proved this, if you don't have good corporate governance and a commitment to values, you have political bias inside media, it inevitably leads to the corruption of the media mission. Thirdly, we need to develop ways of transferring these traditional values in journalism from the traditional areas to the online environment. We live in an open information landscape. We need to sort of create a way of transferring these values and getting them implemented and so on. And I think some of the projects that have been talked about here actually help to do that. But I have to say the use of law to control journalism and expression to limit hate speech and xenophobia and incitement to genocide, which has been highlighted here, it must be proportionate. I really believe this, because if we are not proportionate in our approach to law, we'll give further encouragement to governments who are currently using forms of systematic pressure on journalists to discipline legitimate forms of dissent. So I don't think we can have that. Finally, I think we need to use new techniques. They're absolutely valuable. So we were talking just before this meeting about new systems of using data banks to have truth-telling systems, so we can use automatically computer-aided ways of identifying falsehoods and hate speech. This is always welcome. But in the battle for ideas and truth, we need much more a partnership between an academic community which understands this well, a diplomatic community and a political community which is struggling against the social and economic realities which make these aspirations very difficult to achieve, and the community of journalism. The question is really, how we do that, and that's a really important question. But in the end, I think the only way we're going to be able to do that is to invest and trust in people and invest in the quality of people needed to produce good information. And I think the more projects we have, the more investment in good journalism, then the better it's going to be.
Thank you very much, Aidan. I can use the power I have as a moderator to ask all the questions I have, and I do have a lot of questions, but I'm going to refrain to do that because we are running out of time, and I'm sure that many of you have a lot of questions. So you have the floor. There is, I think you have to press a button or something. How does it work? You have to push a button. Right here. Please identify yourself.
My name is Afaf Kanja with South News. First of all, thank you so much for the various intriguing interventions. My question is about where should this start? There's two elements here. I didn't hear anything about education from the very primary of ages, right? And also the question of tolerance. Tolerance, I don't think I'm the only person here who believes that tolerance doesn't have the best of connotations, let's say. It's more about acceptance, and I think from a very young age. So where does the responsibility of governments come in terms of educating our children, and of course from the family perspective as well?
Good question.
We'll take 3 questions and then we'll go to the panel. There was one on this side. Yep.
Hi, my name is Dara Barlin. I'm with a big project. We've gone around to 97 countries to find out where we all agree the world can be better. And this morning, I was on a subway train where a woman was speaking off the cuff. She was speaking about religious values, and I've been in New York City for 37 years, and it's probably been the worst, some of the worst, most inciting to violence-based language I've heard in New York. And everyone in the room, in the subway, was not only off-put but very agitated. I know I felt myself very angry, and as a pacifist, that's new for me. And I remember thinking very distinctly, wow, what could I say in this moment? What could I do to try and de-escalate the situation? And as a person of great education and in this area, I realized I don't have those tools. I don't know what to do in this situation. And I'm curious as to what is the role of the government in thinking about how do we support civilians in when they see situations like this. What can they do? How do we get them the education to help de-escalate situations while they're occurring? Thank you.
Thank you. And we have the ambassador of Kenya over here.
Thank you, and thank you very much to all the panelists. This has been a very interesting the presentations have been very interesting. I just want to mention a couple of things because Kenya has been mentioned a number of times, and I think it's important that I just say what I need to say about this. And the first is that it really is very important that we get the predictive and preventive aspects of this crisis around issues of genocide right. I think that is of critical importance. And for me, I think we should really appreciate that genocide is not arbitrary. It is something that is targeted, as has been said here. And in my country, I think it's important that we don't conflate all ethnicity, all tribes together, and that we are brave enough to begin to say that there has been a trend that targets certain individuals. Because in the case of Europe, it wasn't just all European peoples, it was the Jews, and there was someone targeting them. In the case of Rwanda, it was the Tutsi, and there was someone targeting them. In the case of Kenya, you cannot simply say that it's just Kenyans or it's just ethnic strife. There is a targeting going on, and it has been going on since colonial times right through until now. The weeds that were spoken about by Susan and these mentions of roaches and so on are referring to certain ethnic group in Kenya. And we have never called it out. I never hear it called out as you hear the Tutsis called out, as you hear the Jews called out. In Kenya, it's never called out. So I always wonder, why is this the case? Why isn't it called out? Because I think if you're going to inoculate people, if you're going to be honest about the journalism, if you're going to be honest about the analysis, if you're going to be honest about the content of the write-ups, you have to call out those who are the targets of hate, fear, repression, whatever it is that's driving this process. So I still don't have the confidence that the international community is set up to help us be able to prevent quote-unquote genocide in Kenya. There's been no genocide in Kenya, but we all fear it might happen. But we can't begin to fear something that we are not brave enough and honest enough to identify it by name. So let's call it out. Let's say who are these quote-unquote weeds and roaches, so that people can be able to understand that this is a targeted process started in the colonial era that's been carrying through time and again for the last 40, 50 years in my country.
Thank you. I take one more question and then we'll do more rounds of questions. The person back there in the room, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Fahad Ahmed. I'm a consultant in the UN system. I have a short comment which is addressed to anyone in the panel who may want to respond to it. First of all, thank you for convening this very informative exchange. I do think, however, that we need to be more comprehensive and more candid, if it is possible. I do understand that we are somewhat, we have to follow the UN norms of discourse here. Anyhow, let me quickly come to my 2 points, which are on freedom of expression issue and understanding of the drivers. And let me just say that the comment made by one of the panelists on blasphemy law, that it should be abolished, I think goes to show, I would say, lack of understanding with regards to how some of the communities, people perceive their religion and things that they deem violate their very core and closely held beliefs. And my home country is Pakistan, and I'm not representing Pakistani delegation here, so let me be clear. But I think we have to be very careful. I'm personally against blasphemy law, but I do know, having grown up in that society, that there is a sizable number of people. It's a minority, but for it, things like cartoons or other the movies that we saw coming, they regard it as deeply offensive, and that leads to violence, very unfortunately. So I think we have to be very careful in advocating something unless and until we fully understand the dynamics, the drivers, the psychology, anthropology, the history of the communities for which we are advocating something. And I would just like to say that against Jews, we have anti-Semitism laws still in Europe, it should be like that. But we do know that most of the people do not have racist views against Jews. But we still have those laws because Jews are vulnerable. Similarly, in the United States, we have an American president which is half African. But we do have affirmative action in other laws for blacks. So I regard people who indulge in violence in Pakistan and in some other Muslim countries when cartoons are made and other movies which are offensive, which are deemed offensive by them made, as these people are vulnerable. So I think we have to really address the issue. Yes, we must have a comprehensive effort where we educate them more, tell them it's a globalized world, and try to persuade them to be more tolerant. There are many ways of doing that. But until that happens, it's just like we have a fire burning. If you want to put oil in it, it will burn more. So I think we have to be very careful. The issue should be, the point should be that we mitigate, we reduce this violence which may be caused by this phenomena. So I just wanted to put this on the table for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the questions were addressed to all the panelists, so I will ask the panelists, feel free to answer one question, all the questions, but please be brief so we can go back to the audience for more questions. So we start with George.
Okay, well, I can group three questions together, the lady from South Radio and the big project and Mr. Ambassador. In all these questions, the question was, where is education and what tools can civilians get? And what about, if I understood you correctly, Mr. Ambassador, it was about, what about the historical trauma? Or what about the reasons for these long-standing issues that are being called out? Maybe I start with that. I think I don't quite understand what should be called out if that was in your sense that I understood it. But I mean, when people are being called something and it's under the surface that has to do with historical trauma that has gone on for a long time, and maybe some punitive action can be taken against some kind of thing like that, but I think education is also much more of a deeper answer about historical traumas that are active in people that they should be aware of and that should be counteracted. And I think education is one of those things. The same thing with tools for civilians. We operate a project that is all about showing civilians tools of how to counteract hate violence, of how to counteract incitement to hate violence, and the sustainability strategy for this kind of project is that governments would institute this kind of education in their school curricula from primary school onward. Well, maybe not. Maybe we can disagree on the primary school, because I think it actually takes a bit of more maturity on the part of the student. But education is the answer. And in our case, it is education of the psychological factors that can lead people to be incited, not to incite others. Okay, thank you.
So I just very quickly echo thanks in particular for bringing up education. We were very much remiss, well, maybe I should speak for myself. I was remiss in not mentioning it. If you said, you know, what would you do if you could have anything as a policy response, I would certainly say you start with education, early education. It's just that in most of the circumstances where we've been able to get attention to a situation where speech is already dangerous, now we need something that's faster. But clearly that's the real answer. With respect to the question about the subway, a contrarian response. I am so happy to hear that everybody, if it's true that everyone in the subway was uncomfortable except the speaker, to me that's the goal. That's marvelous. You know, I'm so sorry that this person said something that was repugnant. But if the audience is all distressed, fantastic. That's what I would like. And if people are distressed, then maybe the speaker can talk and hopefully will slowly be affected by the distress. But even if not, if you're dealing with someone who can't be convinced, as long as the audience is not convinced, then the speech will offend and distress, but not catalyze further harm. I hope that doesn't sound unfeeling. Maybe it's because I'm so used, unfortunately, to this kind of speech. And in response to His Excellency, I understood it a bit differently, perhaps. I thought when you asked for calling out, maybe you meant to identify the specific people who are the targets of that speech. Am I right? So it's interesting. I had the great privilege of working on producing 4 episodes of a very well-known Kenyan television show called Vioja Mahakamani, designed to inoculate the audience against inflammatory speech. This show is generally produced by the actors themselves. They collectively write the episodes, and so that was the case here as well. And we had intense and beautiful arguments and discussions about how specific to be, how much to refer to the particular groups that are targets of such speech, how much to use the slurs, the language itself, because of course we didn't want to perpetuate that kind of language. And in the episodes, it was really the decision of those actors, as artists and as Kenyans. They kind of split the difference. So the groups are called out, but indirectly. And then it looks like you're not in agreement. So I would invite you. I don't know. It really is a difficult balance to strike, though. Freedom of expression is again implicated, because you must allow people to vent their vent their grievances. And sometimes the line between angrily and passionately venting a grievance and attacking another group is not quite as sharp as one would wish it to be. Then one last remark about Kenya. I'm also privileged to take part in a path-breaking effort to monitor the Kenyan online world for hate speech and dangerous speech. There's now quite an archive of this speech collected over the last 3 months, and unfortunately the group I'm working with is monitoring in 7 different languages, and there's plenty of appalling speech in all of those languages directed at different groups.
Just very briefly, on the question of education, I think it's a really, really good point. I would particularly argue for media literacy education from a very early age. And I think that this is one area where there cannot be too much investment. It seems to me absolutely essential that we help to equip people to be able to understand the messages they're getting and to be able to navigate through the very complex and very often very dangerous statements that are being made. So I think media literacy as part of an education program is very useful. On the question of blasphemy, I wanted to the colleague from Pakistan, I've spent the last year working in Pakistan with some great media people who are really keen to raise ethical issues and so on. What was very interesting about that time I was there is that I was very strongly advised not to raise the question of blasphemy, even by the most progressive of journalists and so on. And I think there's an awareness that the reality on the ground is sometimes so difficult that actually raising issues like this can actually make matters worse rather than promote better understanding. So I appreciate the point that's been made here. However, I do want to say this. In this sort of forum, I think it's essential to raise the question of blasphemy and the use of blasphemy. Because in an intergovernmental forum, I think the debate has to be had, because we are seeing a polarization of opinion, and there is a very strong body of opinion which is emerging now, which is looking for some form of international instrument on blasphemy, which I think is a potentially very dangerous development. And I think therefore at international level it is absolutely right for us to deal with this question and so on, even if the circumstances on the ground in many countries make it very difficult to raise it at the moment.
Before you go, I'd like to ask you a question in order to answer the subway question, if you don't mind, which is, what is the role of government? I think that's a critical question, and it's very important to answer.
Thank you.
I do that with you because I've known you for 15 years, which is not the case with the other panelists.
So you can put me on the spot, yeah. No, I wanted to address 3 issues. One is the question of education we all talked about. It's a matter of time, but when I spoke, I was talking about prevention. The best policy against hate speech is prevention, is to prevent hate speech. And for me, prevention includes education. Not only education, it includes education, it includes ethics in the media, voluntary codes of ethics in the media. It also includes community efforts. The communities themselves, we were talking with the ambassador of Norway, the reflection in Norway that happened after the horrible incident of the violence against children. Many people in Norway, because of being such a peaceful society, were not aware of the harsh language being used on internet. And that was a surprise. And it also means then that we have to all get engaged. We have to know what is the language out there. What are our children, what do our children see in internet? What do our children play in video games? Not a censorship of the state, which I would be against as rapporteur, but more as a definition of the values of family and the values of society. And certainly a proactive education, and here's where the concept of culture of peace comes in. UNESCO, the director Federico Mayor many years ago established the principle of he says peace is, yes, it's a political phenomenon. Peace can also be seen as a strategic military issue, but peace has to be understood above all as a cultural phenomenon. We build daily life of a culture of peace, of understanding, of tolerance, of dialogue, of solidarity among human beings. That is a concept we really have to push into our schools. So yes, you're right on. We should work on education, but we should work on a global view of prevention of hate speech. Secondly, very quickly with the ambassador, I think states, the same way I believe that in the extreme cases states have an obligation to prohibit some forms of speech, I think in general states have a constant obligation to promote positive speech. If there are people building stereotypes between an ethnic group of another, I think what's more important is the political leaders of the country, whether it be the executive branch, the legislature, or other state institutions, or the national human rights organizations, that stand out and say this is wrong. This should not be done. We should deal in a dialogue, a positive dialogue. We should build understanding. I think it's very important to take the political risk of having a positive speech. I think the international community should do it as well, and certainly all of us working on human rights within international bodies should do it. But I think it should begin with the leader, the elected leaders of the country. I mean, this is the way you can actually challenge and say, no, this is a wonderful country with wonderful people, and we all want to build some form of understanding. And finally, the third and last question on the question of blasphemy in Pakistan, I have it in my report. I believe that we cannot criminalize certain speech just because it establishes differences of opinion. We cannot deal with differences of opinion by censorship of the state. And oftentimes, and this is the tragedy, when there is state censorship using criminal law, whether it be the crime of defamation, which we're also trying to decriminalize, all four rapporteurs, by the way, my three regional colleagues from the Americas, the Europe, and the African Commission, all four, and myself from the UN, agreed that defamation should be decriminalized. Because every time you're criminalizing a speech, whether it be defamation because someone feels offended, to blasphemy because someone feels that their religion was offended, it is in a way a limitation of free speech, but it normally is used by those in power to protect their reputation or protect their religion or to consolidate themselves in power. And if we give it, it is true that some types, like I found, to be more specific, I found the Danish cartoons tasteless, horrible, and useless. But I defended them because cartoons is a legitimate form of journalism, and cartoons are always based in mockery. And the fact that there was violence cannot intimidate us or cannot blackmail us to say they should have been banned. Violence should never be an excuse to stop defending freedom of speech. And I think that the best example precisely comes from Pakistan, was this young woman, Malala, who defended her right to have education beyond the fact that fundamentalists felt that women should not be educated. She, as a young girl, stood up and said, yes, I want to be educated. She suffered the consequences, of course, and suffered the violence. And thank God she's overcoming that violence, and she is becoming a symbol in the world. But I think it's this symbol of people speaking out. And what better symbol than our children, young girls and boys, speaking out for their rights.
Okay, we are going, wow. We don't have too much time, so please be very brief with your question because we have to finish at 1 and we have way too many hands. So we have 2 people here that have been asking for a long time, so we start here. Please, you go first and then I move to this side. Hold on.
My name is Neil Blonstein. I represent Universal Esperanto Association. Few people know that Hitler referred mockingly to Esperanto in Mein Kampf. There was an overlap between the million Esperanto speakers and the Jewish community. I believe Hitler had said Esperanto would be a tool of the Jews to take over the world, among other comments that he made in Mein Kampf. My question is, how do you deal with the majority of the world who has no idea that this was stated, that he was predicting the destruction of the Esperanto community, and considering we were maybe half Jewish, the majority of the entire million Esperanto community was annihilated. So how do you deal with a fact that a community is annihilated, but very few people know about it? Thank you.
I would like to share an inspirational quote by the late Julius Kambarage Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania. He said, "These 3 I consider to be essential to democratic governance: discussion, equality, and freedom, the last being implied by the other 2. I'd like to make the following points, and my questions are contained therein. Governments are duty-bound to protect individuals from harm, be it imminent or otherwise. Second, I concur with the panelists that freedom of expression cannot be limited, but surely there must be a way of regulating it, so governments can better fulfill the role I've just mentioned of protecting individuals from harm. Then this can be achieved in a most effective way and democratic way if countries have embraced good governance and the rule of law, among others. Hate speech, racism, xenophobia, and other intolerance flourish in societies experiencing democratic deficiencies, in my opinion, poor governance, and lack of rule of law. I personally agree with Professor Susan analysis on effective ways of addressing dangerous speech, particularly by using influential speakers. The paradox, however, is when these influential speakers, the religious leaders, the intellectuals and politicians, are responsible for such incitement, and mostly to suit their interest. And we have many cases and incidents in many countries in this context. So what should happen then? That would be my question. Finally, I believe that there cannot be a universal formula. Each case must be dealt or treated in its own context, but we can all benefit from best practices. I thank you.
Thank you. We move. Okay, we start over here. Please be brief, otherwise the other people will not be able to ask the question. So.
I work for Human Rights First, a U.S. organization. We've worked for quite a while on the question of blasphemy and how blasphemy laws violate international standards of freedom of speech. What I think is particularly interesting about blasphemy is the sentiment of feeling offended enables people to feel self-entitled to use violence to justify the hatred that they are hearing. And so this question of violence erupting and the question of self-entitlement is very interesting, and of course it led, as we know, to the cartoon incident, to the innocence of Muslims, to President Obama himself having to speak about this for 10 minutes at the General Assembly last year in New York, in this very building. And we realize how national security issues are now shaped by this question of blasphemy. So the question that I want to ask you is this, and because we're at the United Nations, and because the fact that in March 2011 and since then, the diplomatic community has reached a breakthrough in calling to fight hate speech through non-legal means and bringing a consensus that didn't exist previously. And unfortunately, we see that the situation on the ground...
Ask the question.
Well, yeah, but a lot of people have spoken.
At
Yes, I'm getting to my question, but many people have spoken for quite a while, so I'd like to ask my question with as much precision as possible. So the question really is, there is this violence on the ground, and the fact that diplomats see this as a question of national security, increasingly so, and then you have this diplomatic, legal breakthrough at the United Nations, and there's a disconnect between what's going on at the United Nations and what is going on the ground, and the victims of blasphemy. And so I would like to ask all of you, how can we bridge this gap between what is going on at the United Nations, which is a positive development to uphold international standards of freedom of expression, and what is happening on the ground? Thank you.
One more question here, please.
DePonte from the Beacon Initiative. I'll be very brief. The first question I have is, how valuable would statistical monitoring of the use of insightful speech based on the work of Benish and other rhetoricians be to the international community? And then to what degree would national and/or international actors actually be able to act on the results of such monitoring and the early warning that it could provide? Thank you.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes, but we may lose the translation. That's the main problem. So I will go straight to the panel. My apologies, we don't have time. I'm going to go straight to the panel so we can answer the questions and conclude with the panel. So who wants to start? George or Aidan? We start from there.
I mean, I just want to sort of come back on so much to sort of say. I want to come back just on the question of regulation. How do you regulate and so on is a big, big question in terms of governmental policy regarding media. Even in countries like the United Kingdom, they're now thinking of, for the very first time, introducing law to try to regulate media and journalism because of evidence of unethical behavior and so on. So it seems to me that the best form of regulation is in the confidence and capacity of individuals themselves to take responsibility for what they do and how they do it. But how do you create structures inside information and journalism for that to happen? And one of the big challenges is building a culture of self-regulation. Seems to me is very important, but it's not necessarily to be done at a national level. I'm not talking about the need for governments to introduce national systems of control and so on. The most efficient form of regulation of media, of course, is by law, because if you put down the law and you sort of tell people that they'll go to jail if they do this and or they do that, you can actually control media very well. It happened in many countries for half a century and so on. But going beyond that, how do we get a much more engaged culture in which people take responsibility themselves? So self-regulation, building structures of self-regulation inside media institutions is absolutely critical. National systems are useful, but it's much more important to get the work inside media institutions, and I think that's very, very important. And my final point is on the point that's been made about how certain recent events, and when I say recent events, I'll go back to the Danish cartoons as well, whether it's the Danish cartoons, the innocence of Muslims, or the famous Pastor Jones Quran burning exercise. One has to examine to what extent were these issues increased in terms of temperature and impact as a result of the way media covered the story. And it seems to, sometimes it seems to me, for example, I think the Innocence of Muslims film, which led to, in this country, the notion that there was something called Muslim rage, which erupted all the way around the world regarding this really minority interest film and so on, was overblown rhetoric by media. And it seems to me that's a very dangerous development, because what media do then is take a story, reinforce it, sensationalize it, and add to the problem without actually making a contribution to dealing with the problem. So I think that it's too easy to say that we've had rage on all of these issues. We haven't. What we've had is media stories which have actually got a lot of play. How do we change that? How do we change the news agenda? I mean, I think that's a major question, and it's all part of what I would call the self-regulating ethical agenda for media.
Just very briefly, believe it or not, I've got an optimistic suggestion. And that is that it's not impossible to change social standards regarding speech. It happens remarkably quickly And once it's done, it can be much more effective as a means of regulation than formal regulation. And I'll just give you a very quick example. In the United States, 30 years ago, blatant racist comments were completely acceptable in the public sphere. Today, at least in the public sphere, they have become unacceptable. No politician in the United States, for example, would use a racist slur since he or she knows that that would be political suicide. That means that arguably we have 100% compliance with a speech prohibition that isn't written down anywhere. On the contrary, as you know, the First Amendment is radical in its protection of the right of any person in the United States to use such language. Yet informally it is very, very efficiently prohibited. And that change has happened remarkably fast in human terms. So there's an enormous amount of education to be done, and in response to most of this last set of questions, I could also just repeat the word education. But I want to repeat it together with that reminder that it can be extremely effective and powerful. And then there are some awfully interesting experiments with doing this intentionally. For example, within specific communities on the internet, such as, believe it or not, video gaming communities. There are quite interesting experiments with shifting speech norms within a particular community so that certain language that has been acceptable becomes unacceptable. If a subway ride were very long, then maybe you could even do it within one subway car. I'm referring, of course, to the earlier example. Thanks.
Before we continue, we are going to continue for a few more minutes, but before that I'd like to thank the interpreters. They have to leave, so thank you very much for all your work. And we will continue. I will ask now Frank, Alan, and the ambassador to give the final remarks and conclusion. If you can take 2 minutes and start from there.
Well, thank you, Santiago. Maybe just because of time, 2 very quick words. It was raised whether freedom of expression can be a universal right or not, given the fact that we do have different cultures and different perceptions of religion, of nationality, of cultural events, and of language. And that's a great question, because let me be very emphatic. All human rights are universal, and we can have no relativism, because human rights are really the minimum standard, or not, because in many countries, in my own, by the way, Guatemala, where we're always criticized as maximalists, I always have to remind people that human rights are the minimum standard of protection that any human being in any part of the world should enjoy for their rights and their dignity. And therefore, there can be no differences, because there are no better human rights than others, or no human beings have the right to enjoy more rights than others. So we cannot allow, because there is explosions of violence, I understand that, but there have always been explosions of violence. For those that were challenging, now that we're celebrating, I think, the 200th anniversary of emancipation, those that were challenging slavery, there was violence in the past. But that didn't make it wrong, it was right. And because they challenged slavery, slavery eventually was abolished. So I think that it is the time to raise our voices, and freedom of expression is the right we have to raise those voices. And it cannot be limited, even if there are explosions of violence. Tragically, I think we have to try to avoid those explosions of violence. We have to try to use prevention, education, and in many ways. But certainly not have different standards of expression in different parts of the world. The same way that I think we should all be very respectful to all religions. I myself consider myself a religious person. But never can we use religion as a way to impose silence on others. I think this is very important, because silence will always lead to obscurity and impunity, and it is the openness and transparency that will lead a better society. So let me be really very emphatic on that, which is why I accepted to be rapporteur on freedom of expression in the first place. And I think this is crucial. Secondly, on the regulation of the state, I think that the state has an obligation to regulate a few things. For instance, the extreme cases, the extreme cases where harm is really produced, like I said, not offense, but harm. Those we were mentioning, prevention of genocide, prevention of exploitation of children, sexual exploitation of children, prevention of terrorism, prevention of organized crime and drug trafficking. Those are legitimate issues that the state can prohibit, either criminally or sometimes a prohibition that is not criminal in other forms. But those are the extreme cases. Those are the exception, not the rule. And the other area of regulation, and I've been just this week at the OES with the rapporteur of the OES working on that, the other area of regulation is how to regulate the telecommunications, which is not a regulation of content at all, but a regulation of the use of the frequencies, which are state property anyway. And that under the principle of diversity and plurality. We have to have a diversity of media and a plurality of positions. And this means we have to guarantee commercial means of communication, community broadcasting and means of communication, public broadcasting means of communication, and now with the new technologies, social networks that can act freely. The common norm has to be the openness in which freedom of expression is practiced. And that openness is often difficult. And it is a challenge. It is a challenge especially with our children. It is a challenge especially with education. But not because it's a challenge, the response is to silence it. This was the response of the Inquisition many years ago, and it failed. I think the response has to be the openness and the maturity that we build into children by allowing them to speak and to ask and to question. And this is the essence of freedom of expression. Thank you.
Well, just to say that when I was saying that we were going to have a very rich discussion, I think I was right. And I cannot but just thank all the panelists. And I would like also to invite those of you who might be frustrated not having had a chance to raise your questions. Don't hesitate to send by email your question to Mallory. Her the email address, if you can take your pen and piece of paper. I give you the MROZM@UN.org. So if you send those questions, because I do believe, because Suzanne was a bit frustrated also not having had really a chance to allow you to interact, so that we will make sure that these questions are spread to all the panelists, and we will continue this debate, at least to make sure that, because at the end of the day, we need to have your input, your impact. We need to get those questions, because this will certainly help us even in the coming meeting we are having to Washington, and certainly the Geneva meeting with Frank. And after that, the only thing I would add is that education has been repeated on and on during this discussion. And my office, in cooperation with UNESCO, we are developing a program on education to Holocaust and the prevention of genocide. We are making efforts to develop curricula for schools. And at the end of the day, as one of my colleagues was saying, when we talk about education to Holocaust, it is extremely important. I mean, there is, on one hand, the shared legacy, I mean, the preservation of that heritage of the Jews. But at the same time, it is important for all of us, African, Latin American, everywhere around the world, for every individual to know about the Holocaust, in the sense that it is really, I would say, that education to Holocaust as the pursuit of the lesson for humanity. And I think that is extremely important to make sure, on one hand, you have the shared story, but also you have the shared legacy, and making that distinction. And for us, I think it is extremely important that we really engage people, even at the primary school, everywhere around the world, to know about the Holocaust as pursuit, as lessons, I would say, for humanity, but at the same time, educate them about the prevention of genocide, to know about what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Srebrenica, what happened in Cambodia, with the hope that no genocide will occur in the future. We said at the end of the Second World War, never again, but unfortunately, we witnessed it in the 20th century, so many genocides. And we are witnessing now conflict around the world, and let's hope that those conflicts will not end with the genocide. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Peterson, please.
First of all, thank to all the panelists and thank to all of you for coming here today. I think many of you are actually at the forefront in fight against hate crimes and also in the fight for freedom of speech. And we need your continued work on this together with us. As has been said, we are ethical, moral animals, and we all have a responsibility. I have a responsibility as a father. I have a responsibility as a diplomat. Then we have the government, who also has a responsibility. We were shocked by what happened to us in Oslo and in Utøya in 2011. But we had one educational moment that I would like to share with you, and that was the response of the Prime Minister to that episode. He said that what was attacked today was not only the individuals that was killed, but it was also an attack against our values. And he said, our response to that attack will be a more open and a more democratic society. I think we, as citizens of Norway, and all of you, we took a lot of lessons from that statement. And for us, it has been an inspiration in the work in the days and the months thereafter. But thank you to all of you, and thank you a lot to the panel.
Well, I was just going to ask for a round of applause to all the leaders, but there was no need to. It was spontaneous, which is even better. So thank you very much all for coming, and my apologies to all those who couldn't ask a question, but we didn't have enough time. Thanks.